Hey everybody, welcome back to Topic 5 here. We're in Unit 4 of the final unit of the course and actually coming up to the end here, right? We only got 7 topics in this unit, so we're getting towards the end. It's about time we talked about corporatization and corporate influence. It's a pretty interesting topic and one which I think you should find interesting, and the role in which corporatization has played in making sure that we have these big sporting events to enjoy and watch, but also stress a little bit about the role that money plays in how they're shaped and what it means, particularly about the divide between places who can get sponsorship for athletes, who help them train and develop, etc., and places which can't. Interestingly enough, when we looked at Unit 3 when it matters most, and we had some problems with some of the countries that get maybe too involved, or we looked in Units 1 and 2 at where some countries get very involved in funding their Olympic committees, and others say no, that's an NGO, and there's separation of funding between the state and the sporting organizations. So the ones that have funding from the state means they don't need as much corporate sponsorship. But if you're going to say we've got no relationship between the government and the sporting entity, we're not going to fund you like we saw that letter from the Indian Olympic Committee that said we're going to be on our own. That means if they don't get corporate funding, they don't have funding at all because the government isn't sponsoring them. So it's sort of a good bad tale, and one which obviously the bigger countries with more economic power and larger companies may have a better chance at getting that sort of sponsorship to grow. So let's talk about how it's played out here in the last few years. All right, let's start here. 1984, Peter Ueberroth. The Olympics are problematic. The International Olympic Committee, like FIFA, these are the two big sporting bingos that have events that countries or cities want. Remember, the Olympics is a city, the World Cup is a country. The others, it will be nice to host, and they want to host, but the IGOs don't have as much power to negotiate what the terms of agreement will be. We saw in that one where, for example, when we were looking at influence from some of these things, where Brazil had a rule that said there'd be no alcohol in soccer stadiums, but because FIFA has sponsors like Budweiser, they have to keep happy, they say you have no right to turn it down, that Brazil had to sign away their right to not have alcohol in stadiums because FIFA wouldn't have come otherwise. And at the time, FIFA had an event that Brazil wanted more than Brazil wanted to have its own sovereign right to do whatever it wants. Okay, so one of the things that the IOC requires, and the same thing that FIFA requires in the documents, is the city, in the Olympics case, has to sign and accept sole responsibility for any cost overruns. So if you spend $5 billion on an event and it costs $6 billion, the Olympics aren't going to cover you that extra billion, even though they may have made $1 billion profit through their sponsors. They're not going to help you out. That's going to be their money to use as they see fit. The taxpayers are the ones who are on the foot, or had been on the foot. So we'll come back here to Peter Ueberroth. Keep in mind here, this is him on Time Magazine twice. Once as the organizer, the chief of the LAOOC, Los Angeles Olympic Organizing Committee, and at the end of the year is Time's Man of the Year, Person of the Year. But the legacy before that was this. This was the legacy of 1984. Actually, this goes back to 1976. So this isn't a picture of an 84 event. This is a picture of the Olympic Stadium built in Montreal in 1976. Now, in 74, 75, the mayor of Montreal was saying, there's no way we'll have a cost overrun, so it was okay to sign that agreement. But what actually happened was they lost, and they lost big. It cost them $1.5 billion more than they made to stage the Olympics. Now, the stadium itself was beset by engineering problems, and it wasn't used very well very often. It's still there and still used occasionally. But the joke was it had been nicknamed the Big O, right? The letter O, because it was the Olympic Stadium and shaped in that sort of a shape of an O. But it became known as the Big O, OWE, because it took them 30 years to pay it off, an eventual cost of about $2 billion because of the interest payments on that thing. So Peter Ueberroth's legacy is that cities don't have to lose money or raise taxes to host a major sporting event if they get the right kind of corporate sponsorship. And everything is corporate all the time or it fails. Okay, so you set up 2 tiers of sponsorship. The first tier is sponsors of the Olympics, the IOC itself, the Olympic movement themselves. And depending on your level of funding, you get to have the right to use the Olympic logo. You get to refer to the Olympics directly in your advertising. You can use the images of the particular Olympics you're associated with, and you get preferred placement within the games themselves. This is a big deal. So in 1984, we'll go back to the 1984 one here, and we'll come back. Peter Ueberroth and company turned a profit. So they went from the one that lost money, billion and a half dollars in 76. The one in 80 we sort of ignore because it was sponsored by the state, right? The Soviet state sponsored it, so there's no real risk there. Yes, it was hosted by the city of Moscow, but it was backed by the country of the Soviet Union. And so this is the first one that's sort of in the modern era, be 84. And I consider this relatively recent, and the reason I do is because I was a senior in high school then, and I'm not that old, so it must be fairly recent, even though most of you weren't born yet. Anyway, what they did was they then collected a surplus of funds and distributed them out to other athletic organizations in the LA area. So a lot of the high schools and junior colleges and some others got funds, some other sporting federations. So they didn't keep them and make a profit. They redistributed them, but it was a big, big deal. So fast forward now, what does it mean? It means that if you're going to build an advertising campaign around athletes, but you're not the right tier Olympic sponsor, you're not an Olympic sponsor at all, then you can't use the Olympics or the U.S. Olympic team in your advertising. And so one of the famous ones that came after this in 1992, Reebok, which was not then an Olympic sponsor, is not now an Olympic sponsor, built their entire advertising campaign around two American decathletes, Dan O'Brien, who we've heard here before, and the other guy, Dave Johnson. I forgot his name. It blanked that I had to put. I'm glad there's a pause function on this recording mechanism. Dave Johnson. So they built their whole campaign around them, and I've included them as a bonus bit. The 5 commercials, 4 15-second spots, and one 30-second spot on how they had to create their advertising without using any Olympic things. But the good news is that those individual athletes got sponsorship, and we'll talk more about the value of individual sponsorship here in a little bit. But the event sponsorships then become very important to not stick things on taxpayers. A lot depends on how different countries organize themselves. I've got a bonus bit for you to read about the 1996. I'm sorry, reading about the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta, where corporatization maybe went too far. Some people say it's too far no matter what, but that you'll be able to read that and decide for yourself. You also have the leagues and jerseys. So jersey sponsorship we looked at a little bit before. These are two older sponsorships. You saw in a previous lecture the Manchester United with Chevrolet, who's now their sponsor. This is AIG, which is an insurance group, which ran into some trouble in the Great Recession. And then the leagues also are often sponsored by economic concerns. So the Barclays Premier League, that's the English league. Liga BBVA is the Spanish league. BBVA is a big investment firm also and banking firm who also sponsors the Mexican Soccer League. We're probably not that close to having, say, a MasterCard National Football League or the Bank of America National Basketball Association, but if you look at the way these sorts of advertisement works, or the way they work in NASCAR or Formula One racing or some other sports like that, where there aren't a lot of commercials, but instead you sort of get the advertisement as you watch the event in some sort of benign way, like with a little sponsor mark that's up next to the score box, say in a soccer game, but you get a continuous thing. That's probably a lot more effective than, what I have a DVR and I can record a football game and watch it in 60 minutes instead of 3.5 hours by skipping the commercials. That means that their sponsors aren't getting their full money's worth. So this may be sort of the method of the future. Now, I don't know that we're going to start seeing NFL jerseys with sponsors on them or anything, but they're looking at how much money goes into these soccer jersey sponsorships, and they're probably trying to figure out what the aptitude is of the populace to accept them, the viewing public to accept them. So again, jersey sponsorships, league sponsorships, the numbers have changed a lot just in very recent years. So in 2010, the English Premier League, the 20 sponsorships were valued at 129 million euros. And as you know, just the Chevy one alone is now worth $63 million a year. And so once you add them all up, you're way past that 129 million euros. One of the things that's problematic is that a lot of these tend to be betting sites, online betting sites. For example, in that 2010 measure, 7 of the 20 EPL teams were online betting sites. Even the BWin here on the Real Madrid jersey that's here on the right, They're now sponsored by Emirates Air, but they used to be BWin. That's an online gambling site, and I think there should be some concern about this when we looked at the previous unit about gambling and match fixing. If there's so much involvement of these gambling centers in jersey sponsorship, so that's definitely problematic. So they may be gone, BWin, but there's lots of others, 888bet and a whole host of other online betting firms. Individual sponsors, individual sports, individual teams also needed. So Oakley's very involved with the snowboarding team. They're looking to be part of a particular demographic. Um, you may be aware of what it was like when Colbert Nation stepped in and helped the speed skating team, the U.S. speed skating team. It was pretty funny because as sponsor, he demanded the right to come and skate in a very funny bit that he did for the Colbert Show. Sort of a different side to this is the concept of corporate social responsibility. It's this idea, this word cloud, maybe you can explore if you're interested, but it's this idea of morality and ethics and responsibility and being socially aware with a particular kind of philosophy that leads you to value certain things like workers' rights, like the environment, like things like that. This fellow here on the bottom left, his name is Federico Adieci. He is the CSR expert for FIFA. So this is not dealing with the companies, but he's trying to get FIFA to behave ethically when they go have an event. So that would mean like encouraging the use of solar panels to solar charge a stadium, to use reused water for the fields, to take some of the profits, some small share of the profits generated from the TV contracts and put it into supporting NGOs doing interesting work. That's their idea of how to use football for the planet, to use football socially responsibly. On the other hand, you have these worldwide, this is the Worldwide Olympic Partners list, and there's some pretty heavy hitters here. So what their jobs are, that some people would say, is that they need to pressure the Olympics and or the Olympic hosts. So that's why you got to listen to that NPR story that's also linked here to hear what they're talking about in terms of what Procter and Gamble needs to do, what McDonald's needs to do, like at the time to put pressure on China. What's their role with China, and what's their role right now as the FIFA scandal unfolds, and they're paying a lot of money to be sponsors and to have the right to use that logo, the FIFA logo, and be associated, say, with the World Cup or with the Olympics. And if the value of that declines because the cost doesn't decline, the value declines because of scandals, etc., then it's a pretty big deal, and they may that would be a little different than corporate social responsibility. That's them saying, hey, that's the bottom line sort of thing. But the idea is that they will be engaged in helping there be best practices as well, even at a small cost to their bottom line. Not a great cost to the bottom line, but a small cost. And we also got to look at media influence too. There's a lot of money that comes through the media, and the real profits come from these sorts of events. ESPN paid $100 million to broadcast the 2010 and 2014 World Cups. Fox then more than quadrupled that fee. 425 million for the 2018 and 2022 World Cups. They sort of throw in the Women's World Cups rights as well, though they may regret that because this year, for the first time, there would have been significant sponsorship dollars coming in, which historically hasn't been the case. So you make your money off of the one event to fund the others, and that's sort of what FIFA does. Actually, come to think of it, is they make such a big profit off of the Men's World Cup, more than $1 billion this last time, that they can then fund the Youth World Cups, that the the 17-year-old, 21-year-old, 19-year-old, 2023, and women's are the same way, all five of those tournaments, and then other beach and futsal and other kinds of tournaments, because they make so much money off the one. But that should mean that the media has some influence to change them for the good, right? That you say we demand certain sort of responsibilities. But it's become pretty important. So a lot depends on how strong the sporting bingos feel. Right now, FIFA has to feel vulnerable. The IOC has to feel vulnerable, particularly in the winter games where they're having trouble getting people to bid. And part of that's from their own hubris, right? That they've demanding that sort of cost overrun coverage, demanded to be treated like royalty, and people are starting to get tired of those sorts of demands that they make when they want them to host. So what does this all mean, and where do we go from here? Well, where we go from here is probably into more and more corporatization and more corporate involvement in sport. You can see it all the way from the little league level, or if you play city league softball or city league soccer, look at the way you go to the field and the outfield fence is covered with signs, right? And when the signs from local businesses sponsoring it, and they do it because a lot of the community comes and engages through the sport, and they're able to get their name out in a different way because they're affiliated with the field, the sports field. There's a lot of that, and there's probably going to be more of it as we change our viewing habits, our reading habits, etc., and how they get the content delivered is the interesting question. It's a very interesting story, and what we didn't really get a chance to talk about is what it means for athletes in poorer countries who won't have the ability to be sponsored. So that may be another divide that we have out there. Anyway, sports and national affairs with corporatization and corporate influence.